Go ahead and kick it off at 7:01 in the East Coast. Buonasera e benvenuti. Thank you so much for joining us tonight for the Russo Brothers Italian-American Film Forum virtual film festival and discussion presented by the National Italian-American Foundation in conjunction with the Italian Sons and Daughters of Italy, the Russo Brothers, and AGBO. NIAF is a membership-based, nonpartisan, and nonprofit organization. Founded in 1975, NIAF's mission is to preserve the Italian-American heritage and culture, promote and inspire a positive image and legacy of Italian Americans, and strengthen and empower ties between the United States and Italy. Created in 2016 by acclaimed Hollywood directors and the co-founders and executive chairman of AGBO, Anthony and Joe Russo, together with NIAF and the Italian Sons and Daughters of America, the Russo Brothers Italian-American Film Forum provides an incredible opportunity for inspired and creative artists like Zach Baliva to create films that explore the Italian-American experience. Each year, a select number of applicants are awarded an $8,000 grant that serves as a production budget for the story they'd like to develop and create for the screen. Of those applicants, only 3 are invited to screen their films during the NIAF Gala weekend in Washington, D.C., and a final winner is chosen and presented an award during the gala dinner. At this year's gala, just 2 weeks ago on October 23rd, the 2020 and the 2021 winners were announced, and we're pleased to present this evening with the winner of the 2021 edition, Zach and Naomi Baliva with Potentially Dangerous, When It Was a Crime to Be an Italian. I hope everyone had the opportunity to view this documentary prior to the session. We appreciate your collaboration and your patience with us as we work through our technical difficulties. We'll be taking questions from the audience, so please use the Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. Our NIAF staff is standing by backstage, ready to take your questions. And so please use that Q&A function at the bottom of your screen. And now I'd like to introduce Zach and Naomi Baliva. Director and producer Zach Baliva started his career working for the writers and producers of the hit TV show ER. He left to produce My Name is Jerry, the feature film that gave Steve Ewan Minari his first on-screen role. Baliva traces his roots to Italy's Abruzzo region and has lived and worked in Rome and Venice. His wife, producer Naomi Baliva, cannot be with us tonight. She has worked in children's animation and feature films. As Il Ponte Film Group's president, she helps coordinate projects in Italy, where she served in the United States Navy. She is currently studying improv with the Upright Citizens Brigade. Ladies and gentlemen, I'm honored to welcome Zach Baliva with us tonight.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I'm sorry Naomi can't be here to join us, overcoming a little bit of a cold that's been going through our family, and she's taking care of our son and helping him heal tonight. But I'm happy to be here kind of for the both of us and for the whole Potentially Dangerous team. This really took a kind of small but mighty core team, and really want to value and honor their contributions as well. But we're so happy to be with you. And thanks to everybody who has seen or will be watching our film. This has been a labor of love, and we're really happy to share it with everybody.
Yeah, and what a film it is, Zach. So I'm going to kick off our discussion with this was such a powerful topic, one that, many people have not learned about in their history books, in their history classes. Why did you feel like you needed to make this documentary now? And what are you hoping viewers take from this film?
Yeah, and that untold story element of it is really one of the motivating factors. I mean, I was really struck when I first learned about it as an Italian American, as somebody with dual citizenship, as somebody who went through that process and thought that I was reasonably well connected with my culture and my heritage and my identity. I didn't know about this story. And when you talk about to the historians and the people who are in our film, that's the response they always get is, it first shocked them. And then as they started to share it with others, the people that they told, most of them hadn't known about this story. And so that was one motivating factor. And the other is time. A lot of people that we featured in Potentially Dangerous and that we talked to for research and to gather these stories, these events happened decades and decades ago. And so these people aren't going to be with us forever, unfortunately. And so now is the time to capture their stories, to get them on screen, and to share this story so it's no longer an untold story. So that was really what motivated us to tell the story and to make Potentially Dangerous.
Wow. That's awesome. And you're so right. There aren't many people left in our world, and especially in our country, that remember that decade and all of those events. So what are you hoping viewers take away from this film that, that in your opinion?
Yeah, I mean, I think that I want people to walk away from watching this just hearing these experiences and thinking about how it contributed to a more full portrait of what it means to be Italian American and how we can recover part of that. I think, I'm 40 years old, and as I mentioned, going through the dual citizenship process, a lot of times there's that temptation, I guess, to gather documents and get signatures and pay the funds and wait. And there's a desire, I think, for people in my generation and around it to be connected to Italy in some ways, but there are these underlying factors that we're not always aware of why there's not a stronger connection, whether consciously or not. So I think maybe just that understanding that there are significant events that the people who went before us have dealt with that we might not be aware of. I think it would be a healthy thing to explore those events, but then also to understand that there is this opportunity to recover a more close relationship with our heritage and with our identity. My great grandfather came back and forth many times from Italy, and I'm sure there's many people in this audience that can say the same thing. And for me, it was something that I was aware of, but I kind of thought that he came back and forth, and I think we romanticize it in our minds a little bit, that it was this sort of fun adventure, but there was a lot of hardship and persecution that these people dealt with. And in this story, we talk about the 600,000 Italians in America who were persecuted and identified as enemy aliens. And, that takes what I'm talking about to a whole nother level. And I think just being aware of these events and understanding what people went through to give us the lives that we have now really brings a deeper level of just appreciation and that connectedness to our past, to our culture, and preserving that culture going forward by getting this story out there is something that we're really proud to have done a little part in hopefully accomplishing.
Right. And you know what? And that is the whole point of this film form. It's to create these films and to essentially preserve these stories for the future generations, so they're not forgotten. All of these great stories, these forgotten stories, a lot of them, and it's a testament to our people as well. So thank you. And I have to ask also, you said you were collecting all these stories and these artifacts. So was there any information that you unearthed while researching the story that didn't make it into the film?
Oh man, I mean, there are so many, and we have to give a lot of credit to the people who have been working on this, devoting, decades of their careers to it. People like Larry DeStasi, who is prominently featured in the film, who has written on this subject for decades. And I think of even people in our crew who, without them, this film wouldn't have been made. I mean, we mentioned Naomi as one of the producers, but our third producer, Noah Reedhead, was also our cinematographer and our editor. And so he helped us really dig through these stories, and he had the unenviable task of taking what was once 15 hours of footage and putting it into what became a 50-minute documentary. So there are so many stories and bits and pieces that didn't make it into this final version. I took a trip to Italy to kind of retrace my roots and meet with the mayor of my great-grandfather's hometown and talk to him about the Italian side of these stories. So there may be the chance to expand this story in the future if we can find sort of the resources and the time and the people and the interest to do so. But there were so many stories, and they all came down to this common theme of these traumatic events happened to this portion of the culture, and it was this secret. And that's why one of Larry's books, Una Storia Segreta, and the exhibit that he really helped put together along with Rose Scudero and another core team of people that helped them, was the idea, and one of the central themes of the documentary is that there were these events that were traumatic. They were never really brought out into the light. And you can see, if you watch the documentary, what happens when you finally bring something out of the darkness and into the light, and the power that there is in telling these stories for the first time. And for me, when we talked to Larry and we captured his quote on that thought, to me, it's the most powerful moment in the film. And we can see people seeing his exhibit for the first time and watching what happens to them when they're able to tell a story that has long been sort of underground and unspoken about. And to me, that was just, every time I watch the movie, I've seen it dozens, maybe 100 times now through the editing process, and that's always my favorite part. But yeah, to answer your question, I mean, we started with 15 hours of footage, got it down to 50 minutes, and there are still bits and pieces that I wish we were able to share, and maybe sometime on the website or somewhere else at potentially dangerousfilm.com, we'll be able to put out some vignettes or some Easter eggs that didn't make it into the final cut. But there's a lot of this story still to tell, for sure.
Yeah, I can imagine. So, oh, excuse me. Our next question comes from Joe Palmieri. He says, do you know if anything similar was done in the face of World War I? My grandfather came to Brooklyn in 1907 and was naturalized in 1924. I obtained one of the Ancestry websites, a registration form that he filled out in 1918 at the age of 48. It's not clear what he was registering for.
It's interesting. No, I don't know, unfortunately. I mean, I wish I was kind of educated enough to speak to this topic. There are a lot of websites and resources out there where you can read a little bit more. I mean, I would recommend, Larry's books that we mentioned and are sitting back here behind me. There's books by Stephen Fox as well, and some websites out there. If you kind of search around, I'm sure you can find some of that information, but unfortunately, I don't have a lot about World War I in this topic.
Sure, thank you. Rick Drum's next question is, what different ways were potentially dangerous people identified? The film identified some were from tips. Do we know how this happened? Were there lists, vetting of tips, other ways the government identified them, and obviously incorrectly?
And I should say hello to Rick, a good friend of mine from the Midwest, probably writing from Indiana. So hello, Rick. Hope you are warm and safe. And yeah, Larry alludes to this in the documentary, and there were for a long time lists, and people would be classified by sort of levels of how risky the government considered them to be, A, B, and C. And there were various things that could get you on these lists, ranging from, very benign threats all the way up to people sort of informing upon you. And of course, we talked about how these people weren't allowed to know necessarily how they got on these lists or how they were informed upon. And I can't remember if it's Tony in the film, who talks about his father's experience, Rosati, I think. Sorry, my brain stopped working there for a second. But one of them alludes to the fact that, the government had these lists ready to go. So they had been preparing for a long time. And then when the presidential decrees and the other legalities put the wheels in motion, these lists had already been prepared, categorized, and were ready to go. And if you read, Joanne Chieti from the Department of Justice is in our film, and she's one of the lead people who compiled and wrote the reports. You can Google the whatever it was, the 2001 Department of Justice report on the wartime actions of Italian Americans, and in that report is the list of everybody's name of what happened to them as far back as the government could verify and trace it. It's alphabetized. It'll have the people that were detained, the people that were interned, and broken down by other various categories, and everybody there is listed. I went through to check some of the last names in my family to see if people that I knew had been affected, and that's that's a public document created by our government that's available for anyone to find online, and yeah, those categories are there in black and white.
Wow. And where would this document be available online? In the
you can find it just with a simple Google search. If you Google, I forget if it's 2000 or 2001 Department of Justice report, Italian American wartime violations. There are, I'm sure there's an official place that you can request it from the National Archives, or find it on the Library of Congress or something, but a simple Google search will turn it up too.
That's fascinating. I'm gonna go look after this session. So Rick also follows up with another question. Logistically, how many different locations did you have to visit to film this?
This was a difficult project because, of course, when we were researching and shooting, we were in a little bit of still, a COVID environment. And so we were trying to follow all these protocols, and it made traveling difficult as well. A lot of the restrictions, as we explain in the film, happened along the West Coast. And so many people who faced the most severe evacuations and other restrictions. Now, these did happen nationwide in various pockets, and these designations weren't only focused on the West Coast, but because of Pearl Harbor and where some of the other Army and military encampments were, a lot of this did happen in and around the San Francisco Bay Area. So that was really our home base. And I forget the exact numbers right now, but we had a shooting period not that long ago, maybe about 4 months ago, where we were there just about 2 weeks traveling in and around primarily the Bay Area. And over that 2 week period, we did, I think, maybe 12 interviews. And that's where really a bulk of our material came from. And then we did a few others as well. We went to the Washington, D.C. area and interviewed several people who were affected on the East Coast. And that's not to say that other parts of the country were immune. They weren't, but that's just where the people we happen to be in touch with are living. And there are pockets based on kind of where these activities were focused around the nation, but it did affect Italians living in America nationwide.
Yeah, yeah. That makes sense. With the proximity to Japan, to Pearl Harbor and everything, it makes sense why the West Coast was targeted so much. In fact, one of our attendees asked I am curious why the communities of Pittsburgh, California, which, by the way, I had no idea there was ever a Pittsburgh, California, and Oregon were specifically targeted for Italians to be considered as potentially dangerous, not other areas in the country where Italians living. But as you just specified, they were in other community, or they were targeted in other areas of the country. It's just the West Coast and the East Coast, just their just being essentially bordered with the ocean and their proximity to our enemies at the time.
Yeah, and potentially dangerous is a very specific designation as well. And there are different, legal designations and terms that were used throughout. And Pittsburgh is one of those places where we spent a really great afternoon or two meeting people at the Pittsburgh Historical Museum, as is featured in the documentary. And we explain a little bit there, but there's more that you can go in depth about. This was a sister city with a city in Italy, and there was this natural pipeline after somebody discovered sort of the fertile fishing land in and around this city of Pittsburgh, California. They were sending word and bringing people over. And so they created this really vibrant Italian community. And as we explained in the documentary, it was also one of the main points of embarkment for that particular theater in the war. And so it was just kind of happenstance that you had this big community of Italians, of people who had not yet naturalized. And then you also had this huge military presence. And of course, when you look at that in a time of war, those two things held side by side are in conflict, right? And as we also endeavored to explain in the documentary, a lot of these people were in their 60s and 70s and 80s and had been living in this country for decades and didn't pose a legitimate threat. But when you look at it on paper, you can kind of understand where the U.S. government might be concerned. And there are so many contradictions that if we had more time to go into in the film, we would have really been able to draw out. There's Rose Scudero, whose son Bob is one of the prominent people featured in the documentary. We talk about how she had to be evacuated to go live with her mother because her mother was not a citizen and Rose was a minor at the time. Well, her father was employed in a nearby facility building defense ships for the U.S. government. Wow. Yet his daughter is evacuated to go with that man's wife as an enemy alien under suspicion, by the U.S. government. So there are all these just endlessly frustrating contradictions. And these are the things that when you say, oh, what's not in the documentary that could be, I mean, I would love to dig deeper into stories like that.
Yeah. Well, part 2.
That's right.
3, 4, and 5. Great. Well, thank you for that insight, Zach. Now we have a comment from Jeffrey Santoro. Ciao, Jeff. He's the director of Big City, Little Italy, which we will be airing on Thursday and having a discussion with him and his brother on Thursday. Jeff has a comment. Fantastic film. What an amazing and powerful story. Many congratulations. Well-deserved honor of the 2021 Russo Brothers Italian American Film Forum. Just curious, finding and sorting through all of the historical footage must have been a massive challenge. How did you source this content for your documentary, and how much time did it take to find the right scenes? The historic footage brought forth a sense of realism for your audience. We were able to connect to the story better as a result, in my opinion.
Well, amazing comment, first of all. And we had the great pleasure of meeting the Santoro brothers and others from not only the 2021 Film Forum, but also the 2020. And we've been able to continue some of those conversations, thanks to social media and email and different things. And that's one of the great benefits of the forum, is that it's highlighting lots of different stories and allowing us to kind of build these relationships and encourage one another. So tune into their film in advance of the Thursday screening as well. And, I've really got to credit not only the other two producers in Naomi, my wife, and Noah Reedhead, who really helped pare down and kind of source all this stuff, but also the other core team that helped us do this. When we were awarded the grant, I don't know where other films are in the process, but we hadn't started at all. I had read a little bit about this topic. We saw the grant. The story really resonated with us. We filled out the application right before the deadline, received the grant award, and then you receive the funds and find out that, well, it's common knowledge, but you're reminded that you have about 5 months to complete the film from beginning to end. And so I really just want to thank everyone else who participated. We did a crowdfunding campaign, and I want to thank those supporters from Kickstarter that helped us round out our funds. And we also had just a really small core team. I mean, in addition to the people that I mentioned, we had, I don't know, maybe 5 or 6 people helping us in different ways bring this story to life. And a huge part of that was finding the right archival materials and finding the right files and the right documents. And thanks again to the people that I mentioned, Larry DeStassi and others who have done great work on this topic before. We had a little bit of a head start. The Historical Museum in Pittsburgh was an amazing resource that we didn't even plan. We were there shooting exteriors and bumped into their staff, and they welcomed us inside. And so huge credit and thank you goes to them as well. And by the way, if you're ever in Pittsburgh, California, Pittsburgh without an H, as they remind me, and thanks to them for making sure I didn't make a fool out of myself over and over again. If you're ever in the area, the museum is well worth a visit, not just for this topic, but several other topics of interest to the Italian American community. It's a huge building next to the train tracks. You could spend a whole day there at least. Wow. And it's an amazing resource, suitable for all ages. I really want to go back and spend some time there. There's some great restaurants in town. But it was really the in-kind donation and support from people who care about this topic. And the people that we interviewed who turned over their documents, who turned over their photos, who made themselves available to talk about something that's traumatic that they did not have to do. And I want to thank all of those families of people who sat with us. And there's Marilyn Peralta Berg, who is featured in the documentary. And she has this amazing story of, seeing 2 of her family members who were arrested together and their picture on the front page of the local news. And their family gave me these precious letters that were written to and from these family members while they were detained or interned. And I had just like binder 1 of 3 years, I think, 2 to 3 years of correspondence back and forth, almost daily, sometimes more than once a day. And I couldn't scan these documents fast enough because they were so amazing. There's this woman at home taking care of the children. And in these letters, she's trying to accomplish all these different things. She's trying to come to terms and understand what's happening. She's trying to keep the spirits of her husband up. She's trying to figure out all these legal and financial mechanisms to keep the family afloat. She's trying to find humor in the situation to keep her own sanity. And her letters are heartbreaking and moving and profound and hilarious. And someday there's something else to be done with these letters, but it's an example of getting the materials that you need as a filmmaker to tell a story. And that's just one little piece of the story, but it shows you that we had these people who want to bring the story to life. And it's not just us behind the scenes, but it's these people who want to tell this story that hasn't been told before. And the last thing I'll say about that is some of those letters are the voiceovers that are being typed at the beginning of the film in that cold open sequence with the black and white letters and the voiceovers. Those are all real letters from people who were involved and taken from different documents. But thank you to the families for being willing to share these stories, because without them, there wouldn't be these compelling stories that we can tell. And I think the story is one that needed to be told and still needs to be examined.
Yeah. And I'm sure they're very grateful to you for having to, shed light on this topic and putting it more in, visibility to us as a community, to the world, to the nation. And so I really do hope that your film makes the rounds in the film festivals and even college campuses. I'm sure if there's any professors out there would like to show this film, I'm sure we can put you in contact with Zach, or I'm sure we could arrange something like that, because it definitely needs to be shown. And so kudos to you for making it, and you and your team for making it and giving respect to these these families and to these stories that went through such a traumatic time in our history. So just out of curiosity, Victoria Martino is asking, is there a national community organization or a support group of Italian Americans whose parents went through this potentially dangerous experience?
Not that I'm aware of. There may be in some of the history. Again, as we're moving fast to tell this story, kind of during COVID, and doing as much as we can to get to sort of the theme and narrow down the story. I'm sure there are bits and pieces that we kind of missed along the way, regrettably, trying to catch everything and move as fast as we can. I'm not aware of anything. There very well may be, and again, I would guess that if there is, I'm sure there's something that exists on social media or elsewhere. But we do want to build a community and keep people connected. And we've got the website up at potentiallydangerousfilm.com. And as you mentioned, one of our goals now is shifting into distribution and doing all we can to get this story out there, right? So we are kind of examining and exploring all of those options and all of those conversations right now, whether it be for distribution sort of domestically or abroad, in the educational markets, different ways that we can get this story out there. So if there's anybody watching that has resources, connections, ideas, or interest in those areas, my email is out there. Potentiallydangerousfilm.com is a great place to stay connected, and hopefully we can kind of build some of those communities and connect some people as we go.
Yeah, that'd be great. Zach, we have a comment from an anonymous attendee, or a question, I should say. The shame these people experienced was deep and lasting, and some of them, when released, enthusiastically signed up to serve in the war. Do you know if they suffered from further pain during their time in the military? It's kind of like, it's, a slap in the face, and then they just got back up and went in to fight for the country that had just...
Well, I think it shows some of that resilience, right? And some of that, I don't know what it is, something about Italians and Italian Americans that we're all proud of, I think. And we feature a little bit about that in the documentary too, and a couple of different, I hesitate to say characters because they're real people, but a couple of the protagonists, like Domenico Rosati, who was interned not once but twice. And if you get into his story, it's hugely interesting. And Tony told us that his wife, Tony's mom, lived in paranoid fear the rest of her life and was convinced that people were listening to her on the phone, and swore Tony to secrecy until her passing. And so these things did have lasting effects. And yet Domenico signed up to serve veterans as a medical professional and worked for the United States government that had interned him twice. And then all of these Italians went and did sign up to be in the war. And I don't have the numbers in front of me, but there are several, commendations and designations and awards that people of Italian descent won serving in the war, possibly people who were affected by these measures, at the very least people who had family members who were affected by these measures. And one of the other stories that there wasn't time to get into in the documentary is stories of people who came home from the war looking for their families, not knowing where they are because they had been evacuated and detained and otherwise impacted by these wartime measures. And so we had people serving in the military while their family members were affected by these restrictions. And I don't know, I think that the willingness to do so says something about the Italian and the Italian American culture that we all share or are celebrating.
Yeah, it certainly does. So how were they treated then in their local communities? Were they welcomed, or were they still treated with suspicion?
I think, I'm not sure that there's a rule of thumb on that. I mean, I think we've heard stories from our interviews. We've been given kind of both experiences of sometimes, maybe depending on the location, depending on the concentration of the Italian communities. We've heard some people have told us that they came back and, it was wartime and people had different experiences. One of the women, Connie, who's in our project, mentioned that the other kids at school, their parents were gone for different reasons. Maybe it was in the war, maybe it was for purposes like my father, who was taken away for a different reason. But to her, at least from a child's perspective, she felt like they were welcomed back into the community. Now, we've heard some stories from adults and business owners who still say it took them longer to rebuild their businesses, or in some cases they weren't able to find jobs. And we have stories of some people who were evicted or evacuated from, places on the West Coast, then tried to move to the Midwest or other parts of the country, and their reputations did follow them, and they weren't able to, find jobs as easily as they probably should have, even though they were highly qualified and respected in their fields. And there were some people who even had, rumors and sabotage follow them as well. So I think we see every kind of experience on the spectrum, just sort of depending on different factors.
Yeah, of course, that makes sense. So Diana Falco asks us, were many open to sharing their stories, or did anyone say no when you asked if they wanted to share their story?
One of the first people I asked said no, and it was this amazing, sweet, hilarious elderly woman. She was in her 90s. She had a story to tell, and it was, to be honest, it was discouraging and sad. When you want to tell this story and you want to get out there, for your first response to be a no. But you can understand why, and especially being on video and being seen by people who will be watching this story. But I do know that others who have written about this topic and who have attempted to tell this story in different ways used to get met with much more resistance and many more no's than I heard. So I think that they would tell you that, first of all, my team is very fortunate that we only heard one no. And second of all, it's because all of these other people have been telling these stories for decades, convincing people that this is a story that needs to be shared. And without their work, I probably would have received many more no's, and the team would have. So we're thankful for that work. And I think people now are just realizing that we're going to lose the chance to tell this story if we don't tell it now, and so I think there's a little bit of that time is of the essence, right? And so thankfully there were people who may have been reluctant before, but are now more willing to share their stories, and we're grateful for that.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely grateful. Our next generations are grateful to all of those who shared their stories. So thank you. Kim Case asks, Japanese families were interned as family units and lost property, businesses, etc. Were whole Italian families ever interned, or just adult men?
As far as I know, at least the huge majority of those technically interned were adult men. And we see, the huge difference in the numbers, right? When you think of, 100,000, 120,000 Japanese Americans, and then the Italian number, of course, is much lower. But you also think of the impact to the culture and the different things that have happened. That's another topic. I'm going to make a whole list now of things that we need to discuss in the expanded version. But the impact to the Italian American culture was still arguably very deep, despite the fact that the numbers were, much smaller than happened with the Japanese and Japanese American community. But as far as I'm aware, it was mainly the Italian men who were interned. And in some cases, as discussed, we did see families affected with some of these other measures. With the evacuations, they weren't leaving minor children at home if their parents weren't there to take care of them. And then, of course, you had all these other restrictions of curfews and confiscations and other things that could affect whole families. So that's what I know about that topic.
Wow. Victor Pellegrino says, congratulazioni. Will this be on PBS? When? What is the process to make a donation earmarked for a future film, perhaps longer? Vittorio Pellegrino from Maui.
Well, that's, a very encouraging and welcomed question and comment. The process for getting a film out there to distribution, if it were up to us, we would release it on DVD and streaming tomorrow. And we know a lot of people will be asking, when can we screen this and how can we continue to follow it? You can continue to check the website for updates. I will just say that there are a lot of discussions and legal steps that have to happen behind the scenes to make all of this possible. And a lot of times when you complete a film like we have, the gap between when you finish it and then when you get it out to theatrical screenings or distributions or the film festival circuit can be frustratingly long. So we want it out there as soon as you do. I'm hoping we can do that soon. If anybody has connections at PBS or elsewhere, please get in touch and let us know. We would love to see this on PBS nationwide, but especially in California and other places where they have these big audiences of people that were impacted. In terms of donations for other projects, we are we are thinking about what's ahead. Right now, we're focused on getting Potentially Dangerous the audience that it deserves. We have potentiallydangerousfilm.com. We are in the final stages of formalizing a nonprofit organization through which we produce content. So, hopefully that will be approved and up and running soon. Right now, there's not a mechanism in place technically, but you can get in touch through the website, and we would love to have your support as we figure out how to expand this project or tackle other projects that highlight similar themes and stories. And thank you, by the way. I mean, that's an incredibly encouraging comment.
Of course. Well, we'll try our hardest, Zach, to get you in front of the right people. And if there's anyone out there, let's get Zach in front of the right people. And in fact, there's a ton of comments coming through about, future distribution. So it's definitely, your film definitely deserves the attention. Mary Bucci Bush asks, did you uncover much info about what put a halt to the internment of Italians? If I remember from Larry's earlier exhibit, Una Storia Segreta, an 11th hour decision halted the relocation of Italians and their designation as enemy aliens because so many Italian Americans around the country were in high governmental, political, and business positions. If this is really what caused the end of internment, which it didn't do for Japanese or Germans, the initial designation seems a big lack of forethought.
There were so many factors at play, and I wish that I had committed to memory some of what Francis Biddle said on Columbus Day when he announced that these restrictions would be lifted. Because if you go back and read that document, which you can find online, he gave a speech, I think, at Carnegie Hall, and he lauds the Italian Americans. And it's such an interesting document because he's saying a couple different things. There's a bit of an apology. There are remarks that you have proven your loyalty. And then there are remarks about now you must continue to prove it so this never happens again. And when you read it with the distance of the decades that we have, I won't comment too much on it, but there's a lot in there. And it's interesting for 7 or 8 different reasons. I would encourage people to go back and read those remarks about what he was saying and what he wasn't saying. But at the same time, there were elections coming up, and Italians in America at the time in certain parts of the country especially represented a huge voting bloc. The US had a war to win. And so I think that there were calculations that weren't necessarily shared and revealed in that speech and in other remarks. I think everybody was relieved that the restrictions were over. They could be with their families, they could celebrate, they could kind of move on as a people, as a community, and as a group. But there were definitely a lot of underlying factors. And I think the need to have people to sign up and enlist in the war was probably one motivating factor. And as we all know in politics, not just in the US, but beyond, you have to be aware of, large populations in the country and how they're going to vote and what they might be concerned about. And this issue, was probably one of them.
Sure. And I mean, how ironic, I believe, if I'm not mistaken, Italian Americans made up a huge portion of our army, of our fighting the war in Italy and in Normandy, and so it's rather ironic. But Ellen Schick asks, on the topic of comparisons with the Japanese internment, do you have any opinions why the Italian American experience was so unknown?
Yeah, we touch upon that a little bit in the film, maybe not in great depth, but I'm trying to think of who it was. Teresa DeLuca and some of the others in the film talk, I think, really insightfully about the Italian culture. And I'm by no means an expert on Japanese or Japanese American culture, so I can't speak to similarities or differences here. But I really do think that those two Italian notions, one of the bella figura, right? Always wanting to put your best foot forward and making a really good impression. And then vergogna, right? This idea of shame. And this was just such a shameful topic that they just didn't want to talk about it. They wanted to move on. And again, I know I'm belaboring a point here, But another theme that we could really go into is and we did a little bit, but more in depth. I think it deserves a really full discussion. Is what were the lasting impacts on Italian American culture? Because I start to think, even myself, if I had been through this, the next several years, I wouldn't want my children to be, speaking Italian out on the street, especially depending on where I live or who might be listening. And you think about, the Italian culture in America, or the Italian American culture, was probably going to recede at some point. So I don't think that you can say that these events caused the Italian American culture to be less strong, but I think it certainly accelerated that process. And my personal opinion, I know that everyone won't agree with this, and I should probably try to stay away from even slightly controversial topics, but too late. I think that when you look at the way that Italians and Italian Americans are portrayed by, the general conversation and the media, I think some of those stereotypes are there because we lost a more full telling of what Italian American culture is. I think if these events had not unfolded the way that we had, and Italians living in America and Italian Americans hadn't tried to repress some of their culture as a way to cope and seem less Italian, I think we would have a more full expression of what it means to be Italian American, and some of those nuanced stereotypes that exist today wouldn't be the same.
Sure. Wow, that's an interesting way to look at it for sure. In fact, Anita Indelicato from Boston, Massachusetts says, your film enlightened part of my childhood during World War II. I now understand why during that time my family stressed that we were American, but we certainly were Italian. Thank you for this important part of our history. And she goes on to say, can you comment on the dichotomy of being part of two countries?
Wow. I mean, there's a little bit of a split identity, I think, but also I don't really know what to say about it, other than I'm thankful for a little bit of the different perspective that it challenges me to have, and maybe questioning some of the assumptions that are out there. I don't know, maybe it's one of the many reasons that I like being able to tell some of these stories, because you can challenge some thoughts and some opinions, and you just sort of have an excuse to look at things a different way. And one of the things that I think going through this project helped me understand is that this is a very complicated and nuanced topic that affected different people in different ways, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think a lot of the time, our own assumption is that if we haven't been through anything personally, then it didn't happen, or it doesn't matter, or other people are exaggerating, or it's not true. And, just because people in one part of the country didn't experience these restrictions doesn't lessen the impact that they had on a culture as a whole, and I think that's one of the takeaways that I had. When you work on a project like this, it affects you in different ways. And I think one of the things that it did to me was just, it gave me that encouragement not to assume things about people or cultures, even my own, just because I haven't personally experienced it. It can still be true, even if I didn't experience it. I've never seen my congressman in person, right? But he exists. But, it doesn't change the fact that I haven't seen him in person. And that can be true with experiences as well. Just because, every Italian person that didn't know about this story, or wasn't detained, or wasn't interned, or isn't aware of how it affected their culture, these things still happen. And it's important that we talk about them.
Yeah. Diana asked, do you think the Italians will ever receive an apology?
We're so calculated about everything we do politically right now, and there are so many factors going on that you have to think about, different administrations and where we are right now. I think there's a lot of modern day overlap with the themes that we attempted to raise in Potentially Dangerous.
Mm-hmm.
It happened very recently in Canada, I'll say that. And this is another area where people have very strong opinions on whether or not it's necessary. And I will just say that I think, without exception, everyone that we interviewed for this project who had family members affected says that it would be meaningful to them if there was an apology. I don't know if it will ever happen, but there wasn't one person that I remember talking to who was personally affected or somebody in their family was, where they felt the opposite way. Every single person said that it would be meaningful and it would bring them some closure.
Yeah, certainly. Thank you. Laura, we'll just take a couple more questions because I know we're just chatting away here. There's so much to talk about. Laura asked, in one interview in the Fruitvale area of Oakland, the subject referred to different sections that were legal and his father could not operate his stores as it was on the wrong side of the street. Can you explain more about this? Thank you.
So this was Bronzini, Al Bronzini, and Al Bronzini is an amazing human. If he's watching tonight, hello, Al. And one of the segments that someday I'm going to put this out there somewhere, he goes by Al Bronzini, but his Italian name is Velio. And to me, like this experience of watching him sort of choose an American or an Italian identity really encapsulates a lot of what we're talking about. And there was this section while we were sitting for his interview where I started speaking to him in Italian, and just to see the light bulb go off in his head a little bit. And I said to him, help me understand something. Who are you? Are you Al or are you Velio? And why? And he starts responding in Italian. And then halfway through, he switches to English, and he's saying that, like, you know, my grandkids, everybody calls me Al, but if you say Al, I might not know to turn around. And so it's like this beautiful example of somebody, you know, caught in between both of these cultures who had these experiences, and to seeing, you know, how they play out for him now in his, you know, late 80s or early 90s. And, you know, we've had other stories. Ivano Camelli, who's in the documentary, talks about going to school. You know, he said, Mi chiamo Ivano, and the teacher didn't understand what he was saying. So she said, your name's Ivan. And then he went home and he said, hey, guess what? My name's Ivan. And this guy is a retired law enforcement officer. And he even told us during the interview that my whole life, I just went by Ivan and I hated it. And I wish I would have gone by Ivano. And so now I wrote a book and I'm Ivano, and you can read his book. And anyway, I think these questions about identity are interesting. But so Al, I rambled there, my apologies, but Al, his family was in the Oakland area, and just the delineation line that the government decided when they set up the restricted zone was whatever it was, East 12th Street or East 13th Street. And therefore, if you look on the map, the market was on, it must have been, you know, the coastal side of that street. And so if it had been on the other side, he would have not been crossing the prohibited line. And Ivano Camelli, who I just mentioned, was the exact same way. His family had an orchard or a farm along the Pacific Coast Highway. And theirs was a little bit perhaps more striking because their farm or orchard was on the water side of the Pacific Coast Highway. The house that they were living in was on the other side of the highway. So they could literally stand on their front porch, look at their orchard, but not legally go over there to take care of the orchard to earn a living. And so that, you know, just shows you these lines and how they, you know, affected families, and a really interesting time.
Livelihoods. In fact, Eugene Mirabella says that he's heard that several Italian fishermen in Monterey had their fishing boats and radios confiscated. Can you comment about that?
I'm sorry, can you repeat?
Sure. Eugene Mirabella says that he heard that several Italian fishermen in Monterey had their fishing boats and radios confiscated. Can you comment about that?
No, that's absolutely true. And, you know, there are stories about Joe DiMaggio's family, you know, being affected in this way in similar parts of the state. And, you know, there are a lot of fishing boats, and that industry really decimated. But, you know, that was also an industry that the US government really relied on because they were producing the protein that fed the people who were fighting in the military. You know, sometimes those boats were taken away, given back with, you know, damage. Most of the time they were given back though. And the radios, I think, is another really culturally interesting part, because these were radios that you could use to hear broadcasts coming from Italy. So of course the government's concern was that people were using them to communicate back and forth, but these were the primary way that Italians were connected to their culture. People that loved to hear the opera, for example. And we've heard Al Bronzini and others talk about the embarrassment of, you know, these radios. I'm sure people know were big, you know, console radios. And so Al remembers standing there watching the police move this huge radio out of his house, loading it into the back of a squad car with all the neighbors along the street watching this happen. And this would have been a prized possession that the family saved up for and was so excited when it came home. And so to watch it be ripped out of the home, not only was that embarrassing, but this was also the connection to the motherland, you know.
Yeah, it's heartbreaking. Marcus Hillman says, being from German descent, this helped me to look into what happened to German Americans during World War II. Congrats on the win, and thank you for bringing this to light, as I have only heard of what happened to the Japanese. Can you share what is next for the film? I guess we're all waiting for you to hit the big screens with this film.
Well, we can say hello to Marcus, another family friend. So glad that he and others are joining us. And I should just say too that I've been relying on everyone to pass over the questions. I just saw the chat and feel kind of rude that I'm not reading all these as we talk. Hopefully they're available afterwards. What is next for the film? Just is trying to, again, to get it out there as widely as we can. We're motivated by the fact that we want this story to get out there, not necessarily for us, but because we think it's an important story that will help preserve Italian American culture. We're hugely grateful to NIAF and for all of the sponsors of the Film Forum, because as I said at the gala and will continue to say as many times as possible, this film would not have been made otherwise. I mean, the motivating possibility between being able to bring this story to life was the Film Forum. And there are people who worked on this project that aren't Italian. There are people who worked on this project that are Italian, and they all care about this story now. And we really just want to get it out there to preserve culture so people can be educated to understand what happened. And I will say that, this has been almost, if not more than a full-time job since the day we learned about the Film Forum and about the grant. So, we were working towards the gala on the 23rd and working towards the screening today. So, when we're off here, I'm going to take a deep breath and, continue to be grateful for the team that brought this story to life, try to enjoy this accomplishment for a moment. And then tomorrow, continue to move forward with figuring out how to get it out there to the public.
Yeah, absolutely. Definitely take a breather a little bit and then let's get that out there. So I'm just going to conclude with Suzanne's story and last question of the evening. Suzanne Angioli, in 1961, on the usual Sunday visit to my grandmother, she blurts out that she had 14 sons in the U.S. Army and the FBI came and took her radio. When I got home, I asked my father, and he said that they took it because they thought she was communicating with Mussolini. Wasn't until 1995 when I saw Larry DeStassi's book and his scheduled talks that I realized what happened. This happened to my grandparents in 1942 in Hanford, California, a very small agricultural town in Central California. My question, I have done a lot of reading. I read that 107 houses had contraband taken, radio, guns, flashlights in California. Is there a historical record that you know of these houses? And what was taken from them? There was absolutely no compensation ever for what was taken. My grandmother was always very bitter.
Wow, I don't want to answer incorrectly. I will say that I think you can find at least partial accounting of some of these things out there. Unfortunately, I don't have the source off the top of my head, but I do feel like in either the Department of Justice report or somewhere else, I've seen a list of some of the items, at least when there were fishing boats, for example, that could be accounted for and categorized into a list. I think there is a list of the fishing boats, and I'm sure Larry and some of the other historians watching this are shaking their heads, and I wish they could chime in, but I do think there are at least partial accountings of those items. Now, I would imagine that every flashlight that was taken is probably not recorded somewhere, but it's amazing if you look at some of these resources. I know the Italian American Museum of Los Angeles and others in their collections have pictures of some of the confiscation rooms where these items were kept, and I mean they're piled high, floor to ceiling, of cameras and flashlights and radios. And I remember, I'm trying to think of who it was. I think it might have been Al Bronzini. When we were making the film, we would ask for photographs, and he would kind of shrug and say, you know what, I can give you photographs before and I can give you photographs after, but we could not have a camera for the duration of these wartime events. And, so that just struck me as a really kind of sad fact. But I do think there are partial catalogs somewhere.
Great. Well, thank you. Thank you, Zach. And thank you for everyone for submitting your questions tonight. We had a great conversation, and it's also due to the audience and the great questions. So I just want to remind everyone that we did record this session, so we'll be sending it out along with the link to the film, just in case if you haven't seen it in its entirety. I invite you to watch it and share it, share the story with your family and friends. We don't know, Zach, how long will that link be available? 30 days, 2 weeks?
It'll be, yeah, I mean, it'll be shorter, unfortunately. I would advise people to kind of rush there as quickly as you can. I will tell, I know a lot of people I can see in the chat have sort of been asking about next steps. And for us, when we talk to people about film festivals and distribution, they're very, very sensitive about how many people have already seen the project in a public forum. So, you know, unfortunately, we haven't decided on a specific day yet. It's not going to be up there for very long. We would love for you to see the film, but please, you know, make time tonight or as quickly as you can. I'm not going to pull it at, you know, at midnight tonight. We'll try to leave it up for a little bit, but, you know, get there as quickly as you can. If for some reason the link is gone and you missed an opportunity, send us an email, get in touch with us. And I would love to say to everybody in the chat, I'm going to try to read through some of these later. But we're here, you know, people can get in touch with us, and we would love to continue the conversation. And thank you all for watching this film. There are so many people in the audience who have supported this project in one way or another. And you know, I hope it's come across, but we are deeply grateful for everyone who participated, for everyone who supported financially, otherwise, for everyone who encouraged us along the way. Thank you, because we know that we didn't do this, you know, on our own. And a huge thank you to NEOF, to the Russos, to the Film Forum, to all the other sponsors as well. Again, this wouldn't have been possible without this Film Forum, and please receive our most heartfelt appreciation.
Yes, well, thank you to you, Zach, and Naomi. I hope she's feeling better, and I hope your son feels better as well. So thank you to the audience for joining us. And as a reminder, tomorrow evening, we'll be discussing the other 2021 film finalist, Brandon Mather and Zach Laws with Calzones Pizza. It's a comedy, very lighthearted, cute little film. So I encourage you to join us tomorrow night. And then on Thursday night, we're back here with Jeffrey and Nick Santoro of Big City, Little Italy. We are going to be discussing all the beautiful Little Italies that they documented throughout the country this year. So thank you so much for joining us. Thank you again, Zach, for capturing this important story. And we wish you really the best of luck in getting this film out to everyone. So thank you so much. Grazie e buona serata.